buried my husband on a Tuesday, under a sky so blue it felt almost cruel, and I thought the earth would swallow his secrets with him. But I was wrong. The morning of the funeral, my hands shook as I pinned my black brooch in place. They've been shaking more often these days, not just from age, but from memory. From all the things I've carried quietly, like stones in my pockets, walking through the years pretending I wasn't sinking. I remember standing in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection, and thinking how strange it was that I looked like a widow long before I ever became one. We were married for 52 years, 52 years of shared meals, shared beds, shared silences. People like to believe long marriages are made of romance and devotion. The truth is, they're made of habits, of knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. And I stayed quiet very, very well. My husband, Arthur, was respected, loved even. The kind of man neighbors trusted with spare keys and secrets. The kind who shook hands firmly, looked people in the eye, and never raised his voice. At the funeral home, they kept saying the same things over and over. Such a good man. Such a loss. You were so lucky to have him. Lucky. That word rattled around in my skull as I nodded politely, my mouth forming the right shapes while my heart stayed carefully locked away. If I opened it, even a crack, everything would spill out. I had learned long ago how dangerous that could be. Arthur and I met when I was 19. I was young, impressionable, eager to be chosen by someone steady. He was 12 years older, already settled, already certain. He made decisions easily. I let him make them for both of us. That was the first secret I swallowed, that I had handed my life over without reading the fine print. There were signs, of course. There are always signs. But when you're young, you call them quirks. When you're older, you call them warnings you ignored. The first time I realized something about Arthur didn't add up was early in our marriage. He came home late one night smelling of a soap I didn't own. He said he'd stayed back at work, blamed a broken sink in the office restroom. I laughed, because laughing was easier than asking questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to. That laugh echoed through decades. At the funeral, I sat in the front row, hands folded, eyes dry. People whispered that I was strong. They didn't know I'd already cried all my tears years ago in bathrooms with the taps running so no one would hear me. They didn't know that grief feels different when it's layered over betrayal. It becomes quieter, heavier, almost polite. The service began like any other. Soft hymns, gentle words. Then the minister asked if anyone wished to speak. That's when I noticed her. She stood near the back at first, half hidden behind a tall man I didn't recognize. She was younger than me, much younger, but not young enough to be a daughter. Her hair was streaked with gray in a way that suggested stress, not age. She clutched a folded piece of paper like it was the only thing holding her upright. Our eyes met. I knew her instantly, though I had never seen her before. That's the strange thing about truth. When it finally steps into the light, your soul recognizes it before your mind does. My chest tightened. My palms went cold. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. She wasn't crying. She was furious. And beneath that fury, there was pain so sharp it felt familiar, like looking at an old scar you'd forgotten how you got. When she stepped forward, the room shifted. Chairs creaked, whispers stuttered and died. The minister hesitated, clearly unsure whether to stop her, but something in her face, something determined and desperate, made him step aside. She cleared her throat. Her voice trembled, but she spoke anyway. "My name is Eleanor," she said, "and I think you all deserve to know who Arthur really was." A collective gasp rippled through the room. I felt strangely calm, like I'd been waiting my whole life for this moment. My heart beat steadily, almost kindly, as if it were saying, "It's time. You can rest now." She began to read from her paper. Dates, places, promises whispered in the dark. She spoke of hotel rooms, of letters burned, of phone calls cut short when I entered the room. She spoke of a child. A child. That word cracked something open inside me. Not because I was surprised, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way silence never could. People turned to look at me, dozens of eyes, wide and questioning, searching my face for shock, for denial, for collapse. But I sat there, still as stone. I had known, not all of it perhaps, but enough. What they didn't know was the real secret. Because Arthur's betrayal wasn't the first, and it wasn't the worst. As Eleanor's voice filled the chapel, my mind drifted back, not to our early years, not to our fights or our reconciliations, but to a summer afternoon, decades ago, when I discovered something that changed the shape of my soul forever. Something I never told anyone. Something even Arthur didn't know I knew. Something that made me stay. Something that made me silent. And as Eleanor reached the end of her confession, her eyes found mine again, and I realized with a quiet, sinking certainty that this funeral wasn't exposing his secrets. It was exposing mine. I stayed seated as Eleanor's words settled into the air like dust after a collapse. No one moved at first. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. 52 years of marriage, reduced to a few trembling pages in a stranger's hand. Yet inside me, there was no explosion, only a long, familiar ache, like an old wound pressed too hard. As people began whispering, my thoughts slipped backward, the way they do when the present becomes unbearable. It was the summer of 1978 when I first learned how deep Arthur's secrets went. We had been married 11 years by then. I was 30, already feeling older than my age, already shaped into the careful version of myself that fit neatly beside him. He traveled more then. Business trips, conferences, sudden overnight stays that came with hurried kisses and vague explanations. I told myself it was the price of stability, of being provided for. That afternoon, the heat was heavy enough to make the air shimmer. I was cleaning the hall closet, looking for a sweater I'd misplaced, when I found a box I'd never seen before. It was tucked far back, behind old coats and a pair of boots Arthur claimed he never wore. I remember how my hands hesitated before opening it. Some instinct warned me. But curiosity, no, truth, has a way of demanding to be seen. Inside were letters, dozens of them, carefully tied with string, arranged by date. They weren't recent. They went back years. Different handwriting than mine. Softer. Rounder. The words inside them weren't careful at all. They were intimate, desperate, full of longing. I sat on the floor and read until my legs went numb. Arthur had another life. Not just an affair, but a parallel existence stitched neatly into the seams of our own. He wrote about missing her laugh, about wishing he could wake up beside her, about plans that never quite came true. And then I found the photograph. A woman stood beside him, her arm looped through his. She was pregnant, smiling. And Arthur, my Arthur, had his hand resting protectively on her belly. That was the moment my silence was born. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't confront him that night or the next. I folded the letters back into the box, returned it to the closet, and went on making dinner. Something in me understood, with terrible clarity, that once I spoke, nothing could be undone. The life I knew, however flawed, would shatter, and I was already tired. People like to imagine silence as weakness, but silence can be a decision, a strategy, a shield. When Arthur came home later that evening, sunburned and relaxed, he kissed my cheek and asked what was for supper. I told him chicken. My voice didn't shake. That terrified me more than anything. Weeks passed, then months. The letters stayed hidden, but their weight never left me. Every time Arthur left the house, I wondered which version of him I would get when he returned. The husband, or the man in the letters. One night, I finally broke. He was asleep beside me, breathing evenly, when I whispered his name into the dark. He stirred, half awake. "I know," I said. He froze. I didn't need to say more. His silence confirmed everything. The room felt suddenly very small, as if the walls had crept closer while we slept. We talked until dawn, or rather, he talked, explained, justified, begged. He said it had started before we were married, that it was complicated, that he'd tried to end it, that the child, yes, the child, wasn't supposed to happen. I asked him why he stayed with me. He said, "Because you're steady. You're home. Home. Not love. Not choice. Habit." I told him I would leave. That was when he told me the real reason he'd never been afraid of that. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, calm, almost pitying, and said, "You won't." And he was right, because during that long, sleepless night, I realized something else. Something he didn't know I knew. Something I'd discovered years earlier, long before the letters, long before the other woman. I had my own secret. When Arthur and I were first married, I'd been diagnosed quietly, discreetly. A doctor with sad eyes had told me I would never have children. Ever. Arthur was never told. I'd smiled through the appointment, nodded politely, and walked out carrying a truth that felt too heavy to place between us. I convinced myself I was protecting him, protecting us. So when Arthur confessed about the child he had with another woman, something twisted inside me. Pain, yes. Betrayal, certainly. But also relief. Guilt. A strange, shameful gratitude. He would have the thing I could never give him, and that knowledge trapped me. Leaving would mean revealing everything: his affair, my infertility, the carefully maintained illusion of our life together. Staying meant swallowing my pride and calling it love. I chose to stay. We never spoke of it again. Not the woman, not the child. Arthur grew older, quieter. His travels slowed. The letters disappeared. I assumed the other life had faded away, like a bad dream you wake from and pretend never happened. But secrets don't die. They wait. So as Eleanor stood in that chapel decades later, exposing Arthur's hidden truth to a room full of mourners, I understood something she didn't. Arthur hadn't destroyed me. He'd simply joined me in silence. And now, with him gone, that silence was breaking, piece by piece, whether I was ready or not. When Eleanor finished speaking, the room was no longer a chapel. It was a courtroom without a judge. Every face turned toward me, waiting for my reaction, my collapse, my denial. I could feel their expectations pressing against my skin like heat. But I remained seated, hands folded in my lap, staring straight ahead at the closed casket. Arthur lay inside it, quiet for the first time in his life. Someone whispered my name. I didn't answer. Eleanor stepped back, her shoulders sagging as if she had just released something she'd been carrying for too long. I realized then that her speech wasn't meant to punish me. It was meant to free herself, and somehow that made it hurt more. The minister cleared his throat, mumbled something about grief making people behave unpredictably, and tried to guide the service back on track. But it was too late. The truth had already walked the aisle. After the burial, people avoided me. Some out of pity, some out of discomfort. A few out of judgment they didn't bother to hide. Friends I'd known for decades suddenly found urgent reasons to speak to someone else. I didn't blame them. It's frightening to realize the woman who served you tea and remembered your children's birthdays might be living a life you never imagined. Eleanor approached me outside, near the old oak tree where Arthur once insisted we take anniversary photos. Up close, she looked exhausted, not victorious, not cruel, just tired. "I didn't know if you knew," she said softly. "I did," I replied. Her eyes widened. "All of it?" "Enough." She hesitated, then nodded. "He said you were kind, that you wouldn't make trouble." Kind. That word again. She told me she'd been 16 when Arthur first noticed her. I felt my breath catch, but I said nothing. She told me how he'd helped her family when they were struggling, how one favor became another, how gratitude blurred into obligation, how love, or something that felt like it, followed soon after. I listened, because listening was something I was very good at. "He promised he'd leave you," she said, her voice cracking. "After the baby was born. He promised." I believed her. Arthur had always been generous with promises, careless with consequences. When she asked if I hated her, I surprised us both by shaking my head. "No," I said. I hated the silence. She looked confused. I didn't explain. Some things can't be explained to someone who hasn't lived them. That night, I went home alone for the first time in over half a century. The house felt wrong without Arthur's shoes by the door, his coat draped over the chair. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects as if to reassure myself they were real. In the bedroom, I opened the closet. The box was still there. I sat on the bed and opened it again, the way I had all those years ago. The letters smelled faintly of dust and time. I read them slowly, not with anger this time, but with curiosity. Who had he been, really, when he wasn't pretending to be my husband? At the bottom of the box was something I'd never seen before. A smaller envelope, yellowed, unopened. It had my name on it. My heart began to pound so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it. Arthur's handwriting was unmistakable, careful, controlled, as if he'd taken great pains to keep his emotions from bleeding through the ink. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Some part of me already knew what it would say. Another part hoped, foolishly, that I'd been wrong all along. The letter was dated 23 years earlier. He wrote that he knew about my infertility, that he'd found the medical records by accident while searching for insurance paperwork, that he hadn't told me because he didn't know how, that he'd felt betrayed by my silence, just as I'd felt betrayed by his. He wrote that the child he'd had with Eleanor's mother, yes, mother, I realize now, wasn't born of love, but of fear. Fear of never being a father, fear of resenting me, fear of admitting how badly we'd both failed to speak. He said he stayed because leaving would have meant facing the truth. And Arthur had always preferred shadows. At the end of the letter, he apologized. Not for the affair, not for the lies, but for leaving me alone in my silence. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. My hands were steady. I felt oddly light, as if something had finally loosened its grip on my chest. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor wrote to me. So did the child, now a grown woman with children of her own. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't ask for anything, really. They just wanted to be acknowledged. I wrote back. I told them the truth, not all of it, but enough. Enough to let the past rest. I donated Arthur's things. I repainted the bedroom. I began taking walks in the morning, letting the sun touch my face without feeling guilty for still being alive. People think funerals are the end of a story. They're wrong. Sometimes, they're the beginning. Because when Arthur was finally laid to rest, so was the version of myself who believed silence was survival. And what emerged in her place, older, yes, but finally honest, was a woman who had nothing left to hide. In the quiet months after the funeral, time began to behave differently. It no longer rushed past me the way it had when Arthur was alive, when days were measured by his routines, his needs, his silences. Now time lingered. It hovered. It asked me questions I had avoided for decades. I started waking before dawn. Not from grief exactly, but from a strange alertness, as if my body had finally realized it was no longer required to brace itself for disappointment. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and listen to the house breathe, pipes ticking, floorboards sighing, sounds I'd lived with for years but never truly heard. That's when the memories came. Not the loud ones, not the betrayals, but the small moments I'd buried beneath practicality. The way I used to hum while folding laundry. The journal I kept in my 20s, filled with hopes that never learned how to survive. The version of myself I'd slowly dismantled so I could fit beside a man who needed steadiness more than truth. I found the journal one afternoon while cleaning the spare room. It was tucked inside a shoebox, beneath old greeting cards and photographs. My handwriting startled me. It was rounder, more confident. The woman who wrote those words believed her life would expand, not narrow. I sat on the floor and read until my eyes burned. There were entries about Arthur, early ones. How safe he made me feel. How proud I was to be chosen. Later entries shifted, became cautious, shorter, full of questions with no answers written beneath them. One line, written the year before I found the letters, stopped me cold. I think I'm disappearing, and no one has noticed. I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest. I had noticed. I'd just decided it was too late to stop it. That realization followed me everywhere. To the grocery store, where I no longer rushed through the aisles to get home before Arthur. To church, where people still looked at me differently, as if betrayal were contagious. To the park, where I watched couples argue openly on benches and thought how brave it was to be loud. One afternoon, Eleanor came to visit. I hadn't invited her. She called first, her voice tentative, as if expecting me to hang up. Instead, I told her to come. I surprised myself by meaning it. She arrived with a small box of pastries and a nervous smile. We sat across from each other at the same table where Arthur and I had eaten thousands of meals without ever really talking. She looked around the house, taking in the framed photos, the furniture chosen for durability rather than beauty. I wondered what version of Arthur she had known, whether he'd been gentler with her, more honest, or whether he'd simply worn a different mask. "I didn't mean to ruin anything," she said suddenly. I almost laughed. Ruin what? The illusion? The performance? "You didn't," I said. "You ended something." She swallowed. "He told me you were strong." I stirred my tea slowly. People confuse endurance with strength. She nodded, as if that explained more than she'd expected. Before she left, she handed me another envelope. Inside were copies of letters Arthur had written her, different from the ones I'd found. These were angrier, more fearful. He spoke of being trapped between two lives, of resenting us both for needing him. Reading them didn't hurt the way I expected. Instead, they clarified something that had always lived at the edge of my understanding. Arthur had never been brave. He hadn't chosen me, or her, or the child. He had chosen avoidance, over and over again. That night, I burned the letters in the fireplace, not out of rage, but out of release. The flames were quiet, almost respectful. When the last scrap turned to ash, I felt something inside me finally loosen. Weeks later, I received a visit from the child Arthur had fathered. Her name was Margaret. She looked like him around the eyes. That nearly undid me. She didn't accuse. She didn't cry. She spoke carefully, like someone who had learned early how to manage disappointment. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I just wanted to see where he lived, to understand." I showed her the house, the garden, the chair where Arthur used to sit every evening, pretending to read while avoiding conversation. Margaret listened as I spoke, not defensively, not with pity, but with a quiet respect that felt unfamiliar. Before she left, she hugged me. It was awkward, gentle, real. After she drove away, I sat alone and realized something startling. For the first time in my life, I felt no obligation to protect anyone else's version of the truth. I began telling small truths, to the woman at the hair salon who asked how I was doing. To the neighbor who said I must miss Arthur terribly, I said, "I miss parts of him." And that was enough. But the biggest truth, the one that had shaped every decision I'd made, still waited. The truth about why I stayed silent for so long. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't fear of scandal. It was shame. Shame that I hadn't spoken when I should have. Shame that I'd chosen comfort over honesty. Shame that I'd mistaken survival for living. One evening, as I sat watching the sun dip below the trees, I realized something else. Arthur's funeral hadn't exposed everything. Not yet. Because the most shocking part of this story, the part no one saw coming, wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what I was about to do. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of the noise it would make. I didn't tell anyone at first. That was my instinct, to hold things close, to test their weight in silence before letting them loose into the world. Old habits don't die easily. They simply wait to see if you'll reach for them again. But this time, I didn't. The idea came to me quietly, the way dangerous ideas often do. I was sorting through paperwork one afternoon, bank statements, insurance forms, the practical wreckage left behind when a person dies, when I found Arthur's will. I'd read it once already, numbly, but this time I read it with attention. Everything was left to me: the house, the savings, the investments, even the small sentimental things. The watch his father gave him, the ring he never wore. At the bottom, there was a line about any potential claims being nullified. Arthur had always been thorough. Even in death, he was trying to control the story. I laughed then. A soft surprise sound that startled me. For decades, he'd made decisions assuming I would stay quiet, that I would protect what he'd built, even when it was built on omissions and half-truths. He never imagined I might choose differently. That evening, I took out my journal again, the old one, with the hopeful handwriting, and I started writing, not for myself this time, but as if someone else might one day read it. I wrote about the box of letters, about the photograph, about the night Arthur told me I wouldn't leave, and how right he'd been, and how wrong. I wrote about my infertility, about the doctor's office, the antiseptic smell, the way the world had gone muffled around me as the words landed, about my decision to stay silent, and how that silence had become the scaffolding of my marriage. Once I started, I couldn't stop. The words poured out in long, aching stretches. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until dawn crept in through the kitchen window and painted the walls pale gold. I wasn't gentle with myself. I didn't excuse my choices. I named them: complicity, fear, convenience, and then finally, something else: forgiveness. Not for Arthur, not yet, but for the woman I had been, the one who did the best she could with the tools she had at the time. When I finished, I sat back and stared at the pages. There were hundreds of them, my life, stripped of politeness, of performance, of silence. I knew then what I was going to do. I contacted a lawyer, not the one Arthur had used, but a woman recommended by a friend who had rebuilt her life after a divorce no one thought she'd survive. The lawyer listened without interrupting as I explained. When I told her I wanted to contest the will, not for myself, but to redistribute what Arthur had left behind, she raised her eyebrows, but she didn't argue. "You're sure?" she asked. "Yes," I said. And I was. I set aside money for Eleanor, for Margaret's children, not as penance, not as charity, but as acknowledgement, a tangible admission that their lives had been shaped by the same man who shaped mine. Then I did the thing that would have horrified Arthur the most. I told my story. Not to the neighbors, not to the church. I sent it to a publisher who specialized in memoirs by women no one expected to hear from. Women whose lives had been quiet on the outside and volcanic within. Weeks passed, then months. When the letter came back, my hands shook more than they had at the funeral. They wanted it. They said my story was uncomfortable and necessary. They said readers would recognize themselves in my silences. They asked if I was prepared for the attention. I thought of Arthur's voice, calm and confident, telling me I wouldn't leave, wouldn't speak, wouldn't disrupt. "Yes," I wrote back. "I am." The book was published the following year. Not everyone was kind. Some people called me bitter, vindictive, a woman airing private matters too late to matter. Former friends stopped calling altogether. A few relatives accused me of tarnishing a dead man's reputation, as if reputation were more sacred than truth. But something else happened too. Letters arrived, emails, handwritten notes from women and men who thanked me for saying what they never had, for naming the cost of silence, for proving it was never too late to reclaim your voice. One letter stayed with me. It was from a woman in her 80s. She wrote, "I thought my life was over at 60. You reminded me it was only quiet. On the anniversary of Arthur's death, I visited his grave alone. I stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at my coat, the earth settled and indifferent beneath my feet. I told the truth," I said aloud. My voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. I didn't feel anger then, or triumph, just a deep, steady peace. Because the real exposure, the true unraveling, hadn't happened at his funeral. It happened afterward, when I finally chose myself over silence. And in doing so, I discovered something I never expected. The end of a long marriage is not the end of a life. Sometimes it's the moment it finally begins. I thought the book would be the final chapter, that once the truth was written, printed, and sent out into the world, my story would settle into a quiet afterlife, something finished, something behind me. I was wrong again. Life still had one more turn to take, and it waited patiently until I was brave enough to face it. The attention faded eventually. Scandals always do. People moved on to fresher betrayals, louder headlines. My name slipped back into obscurity, and I welcomed it. I liked the mornings best, soft, unclaimed hours where nothing was expected of me. I gardened. I cooked for myself without rushing. I learned which parts of silence were peaceful and which were echoes of fear, and I refused to confuse the two ever again. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after Arthur's funeral, I received a small package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was old, faded at the edges. A young woman stood in front of a modest house, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. I recognized her instantly. Eleanor's mother, the woman from the photograph I'd found decades earlier. But this time she wasn't alone. Arthur wasn't beside her. I turned the photo over with trembling fingers. Written in careful ink were a few words and a date, months before the child was born. He didn't stay. The truth landed gently, but it landed hard. Arthur hadn't abandoned just me in his silences. He'd abandoned them too. Eleanor's mother, the child, all of them, left holding promises that dissolved the moment they demanded courage. For the first time, I saw the full shape of his life, not as a husband, not as a betrayer, but as a man who kept moving so he never had to stand still long enough to be known. And suddenly, the weight I'd carried for so long shifted. It had never been my responsibility to hold his secrets. I wrote one last letter, not to Arthur, he no longer needed explanations, but to myself. I thanked myself for surviving, for choosing truth, even late, for understanding that endurance without joy is not virtue, it is slow erasure. I burned that letter too, watching the words curl and disappear. Not out of anger, out of completion. In the years since, I've been asked the same question more times than I can count. Do you regret staying? I always pause before answering. Because regret is a complicated thing. It assumes you could have been someone else, made different choices with the same knowledge you have now. That's not how life works. No, I say finally. But I regret staying silent. There is a difference. I don't hate Arthur. Hate would mean he still has power over me. What I feel instead is clarity. He was a man shaped by fear, and fear makes cowards of ordinary people every day. I was one of them once, but not anymore. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see an old woman, yes, but also a whole one. My face carries lines earned honestly. My hands shake sometimes, but they write what they mean. My voice may be quieter than it once was, but it is no longer hidden. If there is a lesson in my life, it isn't about betrayal, it's about time. about how much of it we lose waiting for the right moment to speak, about how the truth does not age out of relevance. It only grows heavier when ignored. I stayed silent about my husband's secret for decades, not because I was weak, but because I was afraid. And when his funeral exposed everything, it wasn't the end of my story. It was the first time I finally stepped into it, unafraid of the noise, unashamed of the truth, and no longer willing to disappear. This is where my story ends, and where my life, at last, is mine. I am very old now. Old enough that people speak to me gently, as if my bones might crack from the weight of ordinary sentences. Old enough that the future no longer stretches far ahead, but gathers closely around my feet like a cat ready to sleep. And yet, this final part of my life feels fuller than all the years that came before it. After the photograph arrived, after the last letter was burned, something settled inside me. Not peace exactly. Peace is too neat a word. What I felt was alignment, as if the woman I had been, the woman I was, and the woman I had finally become were standing in the same place at the same time. I stopped explaining myself. When people asked about Arthur, I no longer softened the edges. I didn't sharpen them either. I simply told the truth in its plainest form. He was my husband. He was not faithful. He was not cruel every day. He was not kind every day. He was human and deeply afraid. And I had lived beside that fear until it began to feel like my own. Some nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. That was fine. Truth isn't meant to be furniture. It doesn't exist to make people comfortable. Margaret continued to visit, sometimes alone, sometimes with her children, who ran through my house laughing, touching things Arthur once insisted stay exactly where they were. Their noise didn't disturb me. It healed something I hadn't known was still bruised. Watching them, I understood that life does not correct itself neatly, but it does continue, stubborn and beautiful, if you let it. Eleanor and I wrote occasionally. Not often. We didn't need to. Our connection was forged in truth, not maintenance. She moved away eventually, started over. I was glad for her. And then there were the quiet days, the ones no one writes about, days where nothing dramatic happens, but everything feels earned. I learned to enjoy my own company, not as a consolation prize, but as a privilege. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired, spoke when something needed saying, stayed silent only when silence felt chosen, not imposed. Sometimes, late at night, I still think of Arthur, not with longing, with curiosity. I wonder what might have happened if, on that night decades ago, when I whispered "I know" into the dark, one of us had been brave enough to say everything, not the polite version, not the careful one, the real, trembling truth. But wondering is no longer a form of punishment for me. It's just reflection. And reflection, when it no longer carries shame, can be gentle. People assume the shocking twist of my story was the affair, or the child, or the funeral confrontation. They're wrong. The real twist, the one that even I didn't see coming, was this. I didn't die with my secrets. I outlived them. I became the woman who spoke after the damage was done, after the expectations had expired, after the world no longer demanded I be anything other than honest. And that timing, strange as it sounds, was perfect. Because when you speak late, you speak without fear of consequence. And when you speak without fear, the truth finally belongs to you. If someone is listening to my story now, someone younger, someone tired, someone swallowing words they think will ruin everything, I want them to understand this. Silence does not preserve love, it preserves fear, and fear will take everything if you let it. I stayed silent for decades. I paid for it with pieces of myself I will never get back. But I also learned this. Life does not keep score the way we think it does. It doesn't close its doors because you arrived late. It simply asks whether you arrived awake. I did. At last. So this is my ending. Not tragic, not triumphant, but true. My husband's secret did not destroy me. My silence nearly did, and my voice, found at the very end, saved what was left. That is the whole of it. And it is enough. There is a strange freedom that comes when you know there will be no next chapter written by someone else. No husband shaping the margins. No expectations waiting in the wings. Just the slow, honest unwinding of a life as it truly was. I spend my mornings by the window now. The same window Arthur once insisted stay closed because of drafts that never really bothered him. I leave it open. I like the air moving through the room, lifting the curtains slightly, reminding me that nothing is meant to be sealed forever. Not houses, not hearts, not truth. My body is slower. My hands ache. Some days I forget why I walked into a room. But I remember who I am. And that, I've learned, matters far more. Sometimes people still ask me if I loved him. I tell them yes. Love is not erased by betrayal. That's a childish belief. Love is altered by it, bent, bruised, sometimes unrecognizable. But it doesn't vanish just because it shouldn't have survived. What disappeared was my willingness to disappear for someone else. That ended the day the coffin closed, and I realized my silence had finally outlived its purpose. I keep very few things from my old life. The journal, one photograph from our early years before we learned how to lie politely. A chipped teacup Arthur hated but never threw away. Everything else I let go. Objects hold memory, yes, but they also hold obligation, and I have no more use for that. Margaret called last week. Her youngest lost a tooth. She wanted to tell me. I smiled after I hung up, realizing how unlikely this life would have seemed to the woman I once was. The woman who thought staying was the same as being chosen. The woman who believed endurance was love's highest form. I wish I could sit beside her now, touch her shoulder, tell her she wasn't foolish, just afraid. Tell her fear is not a moral failure, it's a human one, and that courage often comes late, but it still counts. People romanticize truth. They imagine it as explosive, dramatic, something that clears the air in one violent moment. That isn't how it works. Truth is quieter. It's a long exhale. It's the slow unclenching of a fist you didn't realize you were making. When Arthur's funeral exposed everything, people thought they were witnessing a scandal. What they were really witnessing was an ending. And endings are not meant to be tidy. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us ever really do, though youth gives the illusion of endlessness. What I know is this: I will not spend whatever remains guarding anyone else's secrets. I will not make myself smaller to preserve an image that was never kind to me. If my story unsettles people, so be it. Comfort is overrated. Honesty lasts longer. I stayed silent for decades, not because I lacked strength, but because I misunderstood it. Strength is not how much you can endure quietly. Strength is knowing when silence has become a cage and choosing finally to open the door. My husband is gone. His secrets are known. Mine are no longer buried. And here, at the very end of my life, I am not a widow defined by betrayal. I am a woman who learned, late, yes, but fully, that her voice mattered. That is my truth. That is my ending. And for the first time, it belongs only to me. In the evenings now, when the light thins and the world grows softer around the edges, I sometimes sit with my hands folded and think about how quietly everything truly ends, not with drama, not with shouting, but with a long understanding that settles into the bones. People imagine old age as a shrinking, a narrowing, but for me, it has been an expansion, slow, almost imperceptible, but real. I no longer live in anticipation of what might happen next. I live in recognition of what already has. That difference changes everything. I hear Arthur's name less often now. New neighbors have moved in, young couples with loud arguments and louder laughter. They don't know my history. They don't need to. I am not carrying it for explanation anymore. I am carrying it because it is mine. Some nights, I dream of the version of myself who first opened that closet box. I see her sitting on the floor, letters spread around her like fallen leaves, her face frozen between shock and resolve. I want to tell her that she survives, that she will live long enough to speak, that silence will not be her epitaph. But dreams don't work that way. They remind you of what was, not what could have been said. There is a strange mercy in that. I have learned that forgiveness is not a single act. It is a series of small permissions you give yourself. Permission to rest. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to let the past exist without demanding it justify itself. I forgave Arthur not because he earned it, but because carrying resentment felt too much like carrying him. And I was finished with that. I forgave Eleanor's mother, though she never knew me. I forgave Eleanor. I forgave Margaret. And slowly, patiently, I forgave myself, not for staying, but for believing that staying was all I deserved. That was the deepest wound, deeper than betrayal, deeper than secrecy. The belief that my needs were secondary, optional, disruptive. Once that belief dissolved, the rest followed. There is no revenge in my story, no triumphant confrontation, no moment where everyone applauds and the truth stands gleaming and admired. Real life does not reward honesty with ovations. It rewards it with something quieter: alignment. I wake up knowing I am not hiding. I go to sleep knowing I did not swallow my words that day. And when I speak now, it is not to persuade, or defend, or soften. It is simply to be accurate. Accuracy is a kind of peace. I have been asked whether I think Arthur loved me. I think he loved the version of me that required nothing he couldn't give. And I loved the version of him that existed only when he wasn't afraid. Those two people lived beside each other for a long time, pretending they were enough. They were not. But the woman I am now, this old woman with unsteady hands and an unburdened voice, she is enough for herself. And that is not a small thing to discover at the end of a life. If there is one thing I would leave behind, it is this understanding. You do not owe silence to anyone who benefits from it. Not to a husband, not to a family, not to an idea of stability that costs you your voice. Silence can be chosen, but when it is demanded, it becomes a theft. I stayed silent for decades. And when my husband's funeral exposed everything, people thought the story was about him, his secrets, his failures, his double life. It was never about him. It was about a woman who waited until the world could no longer punish her for honesty, and then finally spoke. That is the truth beneath all the others. That is the ending that matters. And now, when the evening light fades and the house grows quiet, I do not feel alone. I feel complete. Not because everything was resolved perfectly, but because nothing remains hidden. I lived. I endured. I spoke. And in the end, that was enough. There are moments, even now, when the past reaches for me, not with claws, but with fingers softened by time. A smell, a turn of phrase, the creak of a floorboard at night. Memory does not ask permission, it simply arrives. But it no longer takes up residence. I acknowledge it, and then I let it pass through me like weather. That is the difference between remembering and reliving. I did the second one for far too long. I have made peace with the fact that some people will always misunderstand my story. They will say I waited too long, that I should have spoken earlier, that silence, once chosen, forfeits the right to truth. Those people have never lived inside a quiet marriage. They have never weighed the cost of speaking against the cost of surviving. Judgment is easy when it is theoretical. My life was not theoretical. It was lived one careful day at a time. In my final years, I have learned to measure success differently. Not by longevity of marriage, not by appearances maintained, but by how much of myself I was able to reclaim before the end. And I reclaimed enough. There is a small notebook I keep now by my bed. Not a journal, nothing so heavy, just a place where I write down things I don't want to forget. The names of flowers I like, lines from books that remind me I'm not alone, moments of ordinary beauty that once slipped past me because I was too busy being careful. Yesterday, I wrote this. I laughed today without checking who might hear. That felt like an accomplishment worth recording. I think often about the women who came before me. My mother, her mother. Women who endured quietly because they were taught that endurance was holiness, that sacrifice was love, that silence was dignity. They did not have language for what they lost. I do. That is not a betrayal of them. It is an extension. If I could give anything to the women still carrying secrets, it would not be advice. Advice can feel like accusation. I would give them permission. Permission to question. Permission to pause. Permission to understand that choosing yourself is not abandonment, it is honesty. I loved my husband once. I stopped loving the life that required me to vanish. Both things can be true. When people ask me now what I want to be remembered for, I tell them this. I want to be remembered as a woman who eventually told the truth. Not perfectly, not heroically, but fully. I am not proud of every choice I made. Pride is too simple for a life like mine, but I am at peace with them. And peace, I have learned, is not the absence of pain, it is the absence of hiding. If this is the last part of my story anyone hears, let it be this. I did not waste my life. I lived it the way I knew how until I learned better. And when I learned better, I changed. Even late. Especially late. There is no expiration date on becoming yourself. The funeral that exposed my husband's secrets did not humiliate me. It released me. It marked the moment my silence stopped being necessary and started being optional. And I have chosen, every day since, to speak when it matters and rest when it doesn't. Now, as I sit here with the evening settling gently around me, I am not waiting for anything. Not forgiveness, not recognition, not closure. I have already given myself what I needed most. The truth, the voice, the ending, and it is enough.